7. Okay. They were actually aggregated to create kind of an index. So the answers for each one of these 4 scenarios were aggregated to create kind of a general index, okay, for each one of them. Your question about how do we measure the security policies and the CETA program and the monitoring, they were questions, and I don't have them with me, but I can give you some examples. They were, again, on a scale of 1 to 7, and they were questions like how, for example, 5 items that make up the CETA program, how often do you receive security awareness communication in your organization? Questions such as that. How regularly are security type messages communicated to you? The computer monitoring items, they were questions such as, do you believe your organization is monitoring your computing activity on a scale of 1 to 7? So, basically, so higher scores meaning people perceive more awareness of these different types of deterrents. Okay. And in looking at the statistics, not to get too much into statistics here, but in looking at the results, there was a pretty significant variance in the responses. So we got good results in terms of, there were some people, looks like their organizations they didn't believe had these deterrents in place, or there was others that had very high scores. So there was a high variance in the responses, which is good for doing an analysis. So that was actually how the survey was. So the way the survey was kind of the first section of it was those 4 scenarios. After each one of those scenarios, they were asked these items. Okay. Kind of section 2 of the survey, after they went through the 4 scenarios, they answered these questions regarding the policies, the CETA program, and the monitoring as it pertains to their organization. So the questions were set up in such a way, in your organization, or currently where you work, what's the extent of security policies, CETA programs, and monitoring. So in the title also, where I have user awareness, a key component, an interesting part of this research is we're asking the individuals, the end users, do they perceive these deterrents in their organizations? So it may be, you could ask a security person, a security manager, do you have such and such policy? Do you guys have security education and training efforts? Are you monitoring your employees? And they may say yes, yes, yes. But what we found in looking at doing some other studies is the end users aren't always aware of that. So in this study, we're looking at it from the end user perspective, okay? And that's really, I think, an important thing, because you could have all this great security in place. Just think of monitoring. If you don't think you're being monitored, that's obviously going to impact your behavior. So we're looking at it from the user perspective here. Okay, and these were the people that participated in this study. So it was end users, again, focused on. When I say end users, I'm talking about just the typical user. So it's not just IS people, it's not just technical people. It's kind of the typical, just regular computer users within organizations. So we got people from 8 different organizations. These are some larger companies across the United States. Basically, some of the contacts that were, in order to get people to participate from these 8 companies, I was working with a research institute when I was doing my graduate studies at Temple University. They gave me contacts to a bunch of people, a bunch of CEOs, CIOs, Chief Information Security Officers as well. Sent them letters, and I said, basically, can I get some of your employees to take this survey? So I sent that to, I believe, about 15 different managers. 12 responded. So that was a pretty good response rate. 12 responded and said, well, first they said, I'd like a little bit more information. What exactly are you going to be asking? Again, when you're asking about security type issues, companies get a little sensitive. So you got to make sure, we're not asking you too much detail here. We said, okay, we're asking people to take these, answer questions about these hypothetical scenarios, so it's not incredibly intrusive, but it is going to take a little of their time. So in response, we gave them, I have their $100 random gift certificates. So that was as an incentive to actually get people to take the survey. And it was 1 out of every 10 people that took the survey got one of these $100 gift certificates. I didn't mention here on the slide, but also in response, kind of as a little bit of an incentive to get the organizations to participate, I gave them each kind of a white paper, a little report, a little write-up about basically their employees' responses to the surveys as it compared to the 7 other organizations that would have participated. So kind of, little bit of how they did compared to some of the other companies. So we got a mix of users from various departments. In total, 269 usable responses. So 269 surveys that were filled out appropriately. The data was good. That's basically what was used in the study in doing the analysis. Okay. These are some statistical stuff. I'm not going to go through that in too much detail. Okay, and this is, you may not even understand the structural model results, but again, this is that same model I had up there before in looking at the relationships that we were trying to test for. Okay, basically, again, do these, which I have there, I call security countermeasures. Those are those deterrents. Do they have an impact on sanction perceptions, and then do the sanction perceptions, the certainty and severity, have an impact on misuse and tension? So what that basically all means is everything was as predicted, except for there was one difference. The security policies actually had a negative impact on perceived certainty of sanctions, which is kind of counterintuitive. It's saying the more security policies, or the more awareness of security policies on the part of users, the less they perceived getting caught. But everything else, at least in terms of the countermeasures, those relationships were as hypothesized. So higher awareness of CETA programs is associated with a higher likelihood of feeling like you're going to get caught, and also a higher perception of the severity of sanctions, and the same with monitoring. Yep.
Do you think that the negative relation between security policies and perceived certainty is because the very in-depth security policies, it's easier to find loopholes?
That's a good. That's actually a good thought. I put it in a paper I read up. I had a couple ideas, because basically I was trying to explain why this counterintuitive finding. So that would be something to that effect. Yeah, that definitely sounds rational, right? So if I explain that again, basically, the more...
Well, the more in-depth the security policy is, instead of saying something like use common sense, if you have this isn't allowed, this isn't allowed, this isn't allowed, then you can have someone say, well, it doesn't specifically mention this item, so that means I can get away with it.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I mean, that might be an explanation for that. Does anyone else have any thoughts? I'd love to hear them, because that's the best. That's probably better than what I could come with. What's that?
I told you they are good.
Yeah, that was very good. That was very good.
Yeah. I mean, I would say generally, the more knowledge of security policies, probably the more knowledge people have of the countermeasures, the detection processes, and and just could be more aware users of how easy it is not to be caught.
Right. I mean, they could be more savvy in general and feel like, okay, yeah, I know, just because I know this policy in place, well, I know how to get around some of these countermeasures as well. So.
And one other explanation could be the more knowledge lowers perceived risk.
The more knowledge lowers perceived risk. Yeah, because that's basically what it is when you're saying, perceived certainty of sanctions. It's really perceived risk, how risky it is, how likely you think you'll get caught. So, yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, anybody else have any other thoughts on that? Yep.
Was there any, and you probably didn't ask this question or didn't look at this perspective, but was there any indication on, did these policies actually have enforcement written in them? I know you probably didn't get to that kind of, you're not looking at that kind of measure, but and perhaps that's an explanation too. Maybe the policies are just don't hold any enforcement.
Right, or people perceive they don't anyway, right? That's a good point. Yeah, so these questions were simply asking about the existence of policy. Different types, does it have an email policy, have a password policy, and kind of aggregated them together. But right, I think that's probably a good point. It's kind of the characteristics of the policy, and do people perceive them as enforceable? Do people perceive them as maybe having some teeth, right? Probably if I were to go back and do this over again, and kind of redo some of these questions, the security policy questions I'd put in a little more detail than simply asking, okay, are you aware of this policy being in place? I would get into more of the actual characteristics of it. And I think we'd probably find some different results or some stronger results for that relationship. That's a good point. So you can yes?
Hi, John. The antecedents to IS misuse and tension is perceived certainty and the perceived severity. So you get the perceived severity, -0.176, significant. The other one, negative .065, non-significant.
It's not